Chapter 2. Teddy read something in a book once that helped him when he was afraid. If you act as if you're not afraid, the book said, you will stop feeling afraid. Why wouldn't the same idea work with unhappiness? If a person acted happy, perhaps he'd begin to feel happy again. For Teddy, being happy meant being on the go, doing things, following his many interests, using up his energy. The summer after his father died, Teddy drove himself harder at Oyster Bay than he ever had, swimming, hiking, boxing, galloping across the country on his horse, Lightfoot. Not too far or fast for Teddy, but sometimes almost too much for Lightfoot. When he and Elliot went out on the water, he let Elliot take the sailboat. Teddy didn't like just leaning back and letting the wind push him along. He wanted to go under his own strength. So he took the rowboat. He loved feeling the power in his arms and watching the oars at work. By the time he entered his junior year at Harvard, Teddy had partially recovered from his grief, but still in a driving mood, he went all out for college activities. He joined the Rifle Club, the Art Club, the Glee Club, the Finance Club, worked on the college magazine. He was elected vice president of the Natural History Society and was invited to join the college's most distinguished social club. In addition, he took 9 courses and did well in all of them. And he fell in love. Being Teddy, he didn't fall a little in love. He fell head over heels. Her name was Alice Lee. She was 17 years old when Teddy met her, and according to him, she was perfect. Sweet, enchanting, bright, endearing, a rare and radiant maiden. But she was not easy to win. Indeed, she may have found Teddy hard to get used to, so he made sure she saw him a lot. He had Lightfoot shipped up to Harvard in the spring, and the poor horse was kept busy, rain or shine, galloping the 6 miles back and forth to Chestnut Hill, the Boston suburb where Alice lived. On days when Alice seemed to encourage him, Teddy's happiness gushed up in his diary like a geyser gone wild. Alice, Alice, Alice. Her name was all over the pages, and then one day her name disappeared. All we read about now is that Teddy couldn't sleep. One night he didn't even go to bed. Also, he was starting to write a book about the War of 1812. As usual, he wasn't talking about his troubles. He was simply keeping busy. Much later, Teddy admitted that when he first proposed to Alice, she turned him down, and he went nearly crazy. But on January 12, 1880, he reported that Alice Lee had changed her mind. She would marry him. They announced their engagement on February 14th and planned to be married on Teddy's 22nd birthday, October 27th. Meanwhile, Teddy had to decide what he would do after he had finished at Harvard. By the time he graduated on June 30th, 1880, he had given up the idea of becoming a naturalist. If Teddy wanted a scientific career, he would have to go abroad for 3 years of study. But he was getting married. He didn't want to hang around waiting 3 more years for life to begin. He would go to Columbia University's law school. He wasn't dead sure that he wanted to be a lawyer, but lawyers often became politicians, and Teddy did like to run things. Besides, Teddy would be with Alice in New York, which was where things happened. Everything went as planned. When it came time for Teddy to say "I do," he threw back his head as he said it, clamped his teeth down hard. No one knew that not too long before he had said "I won't" in just that determined a way. He didn't tell Alice or his family or his diary that his doctor had told him that he had a bad heart, weakened by years of asthma. The doctor told Teddy that he should plan on a quiet life in which he'd be sitting down as much as possible. This meant that he shouldn't play tennis, hike, box, swim, or ride. He should even avoid running upstairs. What the doctor described sounded exactly like the life of an oyster. Teddy told the doctor that he wasn't going to follow a single one of those instructions. He had been making his body himself for years, and he would go on making it. He promised himself that he would live full tilt until he was 60 years old, and then whatever happened would be all right. 60 seemed a long time away. Geared as he was to a vigorous, whirling kind of life, Teddy Roosevelt probably couldn't have obeyed his doctor's orders even if he wanted to. Indeed, settling in New York with Alice and going to law school, Teddy soon became restless. The law in his textbooks had less to do with justice than he thought it should. He wanted to get into the governing class where he could go to work establishing justice in a practical way. Why not get into politics at the lowest level and see how it worked? He asked himself. But Teddy was a gentleman, which in those days meant that he came from a long-standing aristocratic family, and high-class gentlemen did not mix with common politicians. Like Teddy's father, a gentleman worked hard on the sidelines of government, supporting good causes. Sometimes he might be invited to take a political role, perhaps be nominated as a senator, but all in a dignified way. So far, Teddy had behaved as a gentleman. He was working on the book he had started at Harvard, The Naval War of 1812. He was studying law. He was going to the opera and to balls. Still, he was impatient. So he began dropping in at his district's Republican headquarters, a bare, seedy-looking room above a saloon. Teddy, often appearing in evening dress on his way to the opera, must have been a shock to the local politicians, small-time landlords, saloon-keepers, horse-car conductors, who had not much use for a gentleman. Teddy, however, decided that, whether it was gentlemanly or not, he wanted to win over this group of rough, tobacco-chewing men whose English was anything but pure, although his family told him his behavior was decidedly ungentlemanly. Teddy continued his visits. "I went around there often enough," he said, "to have the men get accustomed to me, and to have me get accustomed to them, so that when we began to speak the same language." By the spring of 1881 he did feel that they were speaking the same language, more or less. Then on May 2nd, 1881, with law school over for the summer, Teddy and Alice left for Europe on their long-delayed honeymoon. "Hurrah," he wrote, "for a summer abroad with the darling little wife." Generally, he spoke of Alice as his little wife, or his little pink wife, just as he referred to his mother as his little mother. After a month in Ireland, Teddy and Alice went on to London, Paris, Venice, and the Alps. In his free time, Teddy worked on his book, and whenever he saw a mountain, he climbed it. Even the Matterhorn, almost 15,000 feet high, the Matterhorn had been conquered less than 20 years before, and was still luring so many men to death that it was considered the ultimate challenge. Of course, Teddy had to try it. Accompanied by two guides and with the help of a 40-foot rope, he did get up and he did get down again. It was like going up and down enormous stairs on your hands and knees for 9 hours, he said. As soon as Teddy and Alice returned to New York in the fall, Teddy went back to studying, partying, and writing. He finished his book in December. And when he began visiting his political friends, he discovered that they had become more used to him than he had supposed. One of the most influential men in the group decided that Teddy would have a good chance to be elected as an assemblyman to the state legislature in Albany. So he was nominated, and he was not only elected, he won with almost twice as many votes as his opponent. Teddy Roosevelt, the youngest assemblyman in New York, was in the governing class, and there was no need, he decided, to finish law school. Although Teddy knew he was perceived as different, he never tried to make himself over to fit anyone's pattern. So he must have known that on his first appearance in the assembly he would cause a sensation. Perhaps he even enjoyed it. Instead of regular glasses, he wore a pair of fancy pince-nez on his nose. His formal jacket was cut away in the front to display his vest with a gold watch chain stretched across it. The tails of his jacket reached down almost to his shoes, and his bell-bottom trousers were so tight he looked as if he'd been poured into them. In one hand Teddy carried a gold-knobbed cane, and the other he carried his high silk hat. The men in the room stared in disbelief and whispered, "Who's the dude?" they asked each other. Later, when Teddy began to talk, the men found him hilarious. His voice was squeaky, as if after years of asthma, his vocal cords needed oiling. Moreover, he spoke with a high society Harvard drawl. "Mr. Speaker," he would say. The assemblymen had all kinds of names for Teddy. Young Squirt, they called him, His Lordship, Jane Dandy, the exquisite Mr. Roosevelt. Eventually, Teddy would make friends with some of these men, but at the moment he considered them a stupid, sodden, vicious lot. Still, he put up with them until one cold day in the tavern, when an assemblyman, noticing that Teddy wore only a short pea jacket, walked up to him. "Won't Mama's boy catch cold?" he sneered. At least this was the general drift of his words. It was too much for Teddy. He took off his glasses, stood up, and knocked the man down, not once but 3 times. Then he said, "Now you go over there and wash yourself." Things went better after this, and as Teddy Roosevelt picked up speed on the floor of the assembly, it was obvious that he was made for political life. He loved nothing better than a contest and a chance to right wrongs. Perhaps he was really a preacher at heart, as some suggested. If so, he had undoubtedly picked up his strain of righteousness from his father, who not only talked about right and wrong, but did something about it. Teddy, however, wanted to change everything at once. He proposed all kinds of legislation, from cleaning up New York City's water supply to cleaning up its election system. As it turned out, Teddy was elected for 3 terms to the Assembly, and it is no wonder that he earned himself the title of the young reformer. Still, even his friends admitted that sometimes he went too far. Once he actually called for a return of the whipping post for any man who inflicted pain on a female or male under 14 years of age. Although he knew he had a reputation for cocksuredness, nevertheless, Teddy said he learned something in Albany. He learned that politics is a matter of give and take, and he found out that he didn't know everything. Sometimes during these years, Teddy commuted to New York City to see Alice. Sometimes Alice joined him in his rooms in Albany, but their best times together came in their summers at Oyster Bay, where Teddy swung into his usual vigorous routine. Once he played 91 games of tennis in one day. He was also planning to build his own home at Oyster Bay. There were 5 important features that the new house absolutely must have, he said. Number 1, it should be big enough to accommodate a big family. Number 2, it should have a large front porch facing the water so Teddy could sit in his rocking chair and watch the sunset. Number 3, it should have plenty of room for books. Number 4, it should have a gun room on the top floor. Number 5, it should have big fireplaces. He might have come along further with his plans if he had not taken sick in the summer of 1883, between his second and third terms in the legislature. Indeed, he was so sick from a combination of asthma and an intestinal disease that his doctor ordered him to go with Alice to a health spa in the Catskill Mountains that was famous for its sulphur springs. Teddy was sick enough this time to obey his doctor's orders, but he regretted it. He had no use for the idiot medical man in charge of him at the spa, and he hated the sulphur water he had to drink. It tasted, he wrote Mamie, as if a box of sulphur matches had been steeped in dishwater and served from an old kerosene oil can. I'm bored out of my life, he said. Still, he did get better, and this was important since he had big plans for the fall. What he needed instead of a health spa was an adventure, and he was going to the right place to find it. He had dreamed about the West ever since he'd been a boy, and now he figured he'd better get there while the West was still wild and before all the buffalo were gone. A friend had recommended Dakota country as a good hunting ground for buffalo, and in September Teddy said goodbye to Alice, took his guns, and hurrah, he was off. As soon as he stepped off the train after 5 days of travel, Teddy could see that the West was still wild. The town at the station stop had a few ramshackle buildings and a number of equally ramshackle-looking men. It was almost as if the people felt no account, perched as they were in the middle of nowhere, and of course it was into that nowhere that Teddy wished to go. So he hired a guide, 25-year-old Joe Ferris, who after much persuasion agreed to take him buffalo hunting. Perhaps Joe thought that this eastern greenhorn with the big glasses would give up quickly when he discovered how hard it was to find buffalo. Just the week before, a band of Sioux Indians had killed off a herd of 10,000, and every day they were becoming more scarce. But Joe Ferris did not know Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy fell in love with the land immediately. Known as the Badlands, the country with its multicolored, strange-shaped buttes was so weird and so beautiful it looked as if it had been meant for another planet. And it was big. From the top of a butte, the world ran around in a complete circle, gloriously empty of any hint of mankind. And the sky, it seemed to have dropped down just to get a closer look at Earth. How could a man like Teddy Roosevelt not respond to such a place? This was hero country, he wrote Mamie, and indeed, being here made him feel that he could be a hero or anything else he cared to be. Yet it was not easy country. The first day, Teddy and Joe had to ford the little Missouri River 21 times to go through or around bogs and quicksand, scramble up dangerously steep and slippery riverbanks. They rode 45 miles, and Joe Ferris was tired out. Not Teddy. That night at the hunting lodge, he was so full of talk he didn't even want to go to bed. The next day, it rained. Knowing that the ground would turn into molasses like mud, Joe tried to persuade Teddy to put off hunting until the weather cleared. Teddy said no, he'd come for buffalo and rain wouldn't stop him. The third day, it rained. Still Teddy insisted on going out, and the fourth day, and the fifth. On the sixth day, the sun finally appeared, and so did a lone buffalo, an old but lively one who took one look at the hunters and hightailed it out of sight. The men tried following his trail, but without luck. Now that he had actually seen a buffalo, Teddy was more determined than ever. Late in the afternoon that same day, they had a second chance. This time, there were 3 buffalo, and fortunately, they were far enough away so that Teddy and Joe could approach more carefully. They got off their horses, threw themselves onto the ground, and crept forward on their hands and knees. Teddy's eyes were so intent on the buffalo that he didn't see the bed of cactus until he was in it and his hands were covered with cactus prickles. He went on. He didn't stop until he was within 350 yards of the buffalo. Then, prickles and all, Teddy aimed his rifle at the nearest animal and pulled the trigger. It was a poor aim, for although the bullet hit, it did not keep the wounded buffalo and the other two from galloping off, leaving Teddy and Joe to scramble for their horses. Again they followed. Even after dark they followed. In the light from a full moon, this time they managed to get within 20 feet of the wounded animal and still on horseback. Teddy fired, and he missed, but before he could fire again, the buffalo turned and charged. Teddy's horse was so frightened, he reared back his head and hit the raised rifle, slamming it against Teddy's head and sending blood pouring into his eyes. Joe fired twice, missed both times, and again the buffalo got away. After a long day in the saddle with only a mouthful of water to drink and one hard biscuit to eat, the two men lay down that night in the open, wrapped in blankets. Then, as if they hadn't had enough bad luck, it started to rain again. By morning, their blankets were soaked, and they were lying in 4 inches of water. Joe must have thought that now they would give up. Surely this would be enough even for Teddy Roosevelt, but when he looked over, Teddy was grinning. "By Godfrey, but this is fun," he said. Still, it was not getting a buffalo. There would be more days of drenching rain and days of blistering sun before the day would come that Teddy was waiting for. His horse alerted him. Holding up his nose, the horse sniffed the air. Teddy dismounted, hoping that the horse was smelling what he wanted him to be smelling. Walking beside his horse, he climbed a hill and looked over the top. And there below was his buffalo. "I put the bullet in his shoulder," Teddy wrote later, and although the buffalo ran off, Teddy knew he could not survive that shot. Teddy followed and found the buffalo almost immediately, stark dead. Teddy had been happy on all the unsuccessful days, but now with success he went wild. He pranced around the carcass of his buffalo, whooping and yelling as if he were a boy again, playing Indian. When he recovered from his caper, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a $100 bill, and gave it to Joe Ferris. Of course, Teddy was pleased that he would have his own buffalo head in New York, perhaps mounted some day on a wall in a home of his own in Oyster Bay. Still, he wasn't through with the West. The country had claimed him, and he wanted a stake in it. He didn't mean to buy land, but from all he'd heard, it might be smart to buy cattle. People here were talking about what a great cattle country this was, now that the Indians had given up their rights to it, and now that a railroad was handy for shipping beef back east. Teddy had seen for himself the great meadows of thick green grass that grew wherever stones and sagebrush gave way. He may even have read a book telling him how to get rich on the plains. The author said that next to Montana, Dakota had some of the best grazing lands in the country. So why shouldn't Teddy invest in it? Although he received $8,000 a year from his father's estate and $1,200 as an assemblyman, it never seemed enough. And now, not only would there be a new house at Oyster Bay to plan for, there would be a new member of the family. Alice was expecting a baby due in February of the next year. So Teddy made a profit-sharing deal with Joe Ferris's brother, Sylvain, at the Maltese Cross Ranch. He gave Sylvain $1,200 for the purchase and management of 400 head of cattle. He would come back from time to time. After all, he had business here now.